Hello and welcome to this edition of Your Health, Your Wealth. I'm Dr. Eddie Patton, and with this podcast, my goal is to hopefully increase your health set and your mindset when it comes to the healthcare system and talk about those topics that I often talk with patients about in the clinic or the office visit, questions that patients have about certain business aspects of the healthcare system. Today, we are going to be diving into a topic that has been in the news a lot. I'm pretty sure that whether you are a young, healthy individual on no medication, or if you have a chronic disease and on a number of medications, the cost of pharmaceuticals and the cost of drugs is a big issue in today's healthcare system, and one that's being heavily debated, even to the point where in the national capital, in the state houses, we are looking at ways in which we can legislatively or regulatory have an impact on drug costs and what that means to the healthcare industry. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what actually goes into the cost of pharmaceuticals and treatments. It's a very broad topic, and going into medical school, I thought it was a one-to-one thing. A drug company creates a drug and then they stock it in the pharmacy and you pick it up. But as you'll see today, it's a much more complex. There are many other players that go into the cost of pharmaceuticals that most people don't even know about. In general, when we look at the impact of drug costs and high drug costs, one of the biggest things is healthcare spending. The pharmaceutical industry, when you look at adjustments for inflation, have done very well over the past couple of years. And when you look at the chunk or the percentage of the healthcare spending, a lot of it is going towards the cost of drugs. We also have to look at patient access, though. Just because I want to prescribe a medication doesn't mean that patient is going to get that medication. And I can tell you as a practicing physician, that's the toughest thing. I can see a patient, I can figure out what's wrong, I can say, I know that this is the best treatment, or in my professional opinion, and after consulting with the patient, I think you need to be on this medication. And I can write the prescription. But at that point, it goes off into healthcare la land, and I don't know, and the patient doesn't know if they're truly going to get that medication I prescribed, and if so, at what cost is going to be to that patient. And so it really impacts the way in which I can practice medicine. It impacts the way there's fear on top of the patients. That's one of the top questions I get now when I prescribe a medication is, hey, doc, do you know how much it's going to cost? And the truth of the matter is I don't, because it all depends on your insurance company. Where do they have it tiered? Is it 1, 2, 3? What's your copay? So all of these questions are really out of my hands as a physician. But what we do know is that the cost of prescription drugs is steadily rising. And when there was a publication that was looking at the out of pocket spending, and between 1960, where it was low or almost near zero, compared to 2020, where it's an excess of close to $300 billion, the total cost of prescription drug spending. And when you look at out of pocket prescription spending in billions, again, going from about $5 billion in 1960 to an excess of $40 billion by 2020. So we're seeing this steady climb or incline in prescription drug costs. And when you look at the price growth since 2020, prescription drugs have increased 69% all total compared to other things like hospital care, 60%. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed, that we need to look at how can we make these medications more affordable and increase access so that everyone, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your employer, who now are responsible for a lot of health plans, will have access to the treatments, the medications that they need, and that their physician feels is best for the patient. Now, is this problem unique to the United States? It's definitely not unique to the United States. But when you compare drug costs in the United States to other countries, you do see some differences. And there's talk about why, as the United States, are we funding, for instance, the generic drug industry worldwide? Should we be getting these medications cheaper from other countries? These are all tough questions that impact the conversation when we talk about drug costs. Now, one of the biggest factors that impacts or has an influence on the cost of medication is there's a pretty complex distribution system of how drugs are distributed. Meaning, when a drug company develops a drug and they package it up, there are a number of other players that get involved between when that drug actually reaches the pharmacy and is prescribed and the patient picks it up. And each one of these factors that have an impact, they have something to do with the cost. When you look at the actual flow of the pill, the treatment, it's very linear. Meaning you have a drug company that creates the medication. You have a manufacturer that's responsible for making it and getting it out. That manufacturer ships it to the wholesaler. The wholesaler then ships it to the pharmacy, and then the drug is dispensed to the patient. Very linear, very simple process. However, if you follow the money, though, associated with this prescription, it's much different. You have rebates that go from the manufacturer to the pharmacy benefit manager. You have rebate claims that go back the other way. You have discounts that go from the PBM to the pharmacy. You have drug purchase money that goes from the pharmacy to the wholesaler. You have money that goes from the manufacturer to the wholesaler, and then from the wholesaler back to the manufacturer. The health plans get involved because they have to negotiate prices with the PBMs. Patients have to pay the health plans, of course, to get on the prescription drug plans. So the flow of the actual money is all over the place as opposed to the actual flow of the medication that looks pretty linear. And it's very hard to follow. I remember watching a 60 Minutes special. Had to be a couple of years ago, looking at the generic drug market, and two of the specialists who have studied pharmaceutical drug pricing for years, they discuss this flow and how complicated the flow of the money that goes along with the prescription drugs. And with that confusion, it's hard to really pinpoint where the problem is when it comes to the drug costs and the increased drug pricing. Now, I want to be very clear. The pharmaceutical companies themselves are a for-profit entity, meaning that they have an obligation to shareholders to increase shareholder value. And so they're run like a business. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That is the system we have in the United States. And so pharmaceutical companies have an obligation. They put a lot of money into research and developing these drugs. And from a business standpoint, they have the right to recoup those costs of R&D and create a list price for these medications. But what happens after that is where the story gets pretty murky. So I'm going to go through, and just as I talk about these different entities, just kind of want to give you a little glossary of what they all are. So manufacturers, when I say manufacturers, those are the ones who actually produce the drug and manage the distribution. So they contract with the wholesaler and negotiate discounted prices for like large bulk prices for the medications and so forth. They then pay the wholesaler a service fee to manage the inventory, financial transactions, and so forth. So now the wholesalers, they are the ones that purchase the drugs from the manufacturers and distribute it to the customers. So who are the customers? The customers can be independent pharmacies. They can be chain pharmacies like CVS or Walgreens, mail order pharmacies, hospitals, long-term care facilities. So all of these are the customers that purchase these drugs from the wholesaler. Now, the interesting thing is, in the United States, there are essentially 3 wholesalers that control the whole market. So there's Amerisource Virgin, which was rebranded as Sensora after the lawsuit issues concerning the prescription pain medication. So you have Cardinal Health and McKesson. Now, with only 3 wholesalers controlling 90% of the industry, you can see how, with the lack of competition, pricing can then become an issue, because you don't have that competition of multiple wholesalers coming into the market negotiating cheaper prices. Now, next you have these pharmacy benefit managers. And when I first got into healthcare, I had no idea that PBMs even existed. But the goal of the PBM is to negotiate rebates and discounts with the manufacturers, and they work very closely with the health plans in designing what's called a formulary. Now, formularies are very important, and when you're choosing what type of insurance plan that you want to make sure and pay attention to the formulary. Particularly if you're already on a medication, you want to know, is that medication part of the formulary? So what a formulary is a list of drugs that are covered under your health plan. And they have it under a tier placement system, so that if a drug is like a tier 1, it may only cost you, let's just say, $10 versus a tier 3 or 4 where you have to pay hundreds of dollars. This formulary and tiering system, can cause a lot of problems, especially for physicians as they try to prescribe a medication, because again, I don't know with your insurance what's on the formulary, what's tiered. So if I, for instance, you need this medication for this illness, and I write the prescription, your insurance company may come back and say, well, this is not in formulary. So either the patient's going to have to pay some extremely large sum of money per month, or you're going to have to change the prescription to something that is on formulary, which in my professional opinion, or I've talking with the patient, may not be the best medication for that patient. But nonetheless, you have to do, or we have to act according to these formularies that are negotiated and decided with these health plans. Now, the PBMs submit rebate claims to the manufacturers for payments, but in most cases, a lot of these rebates or discounts, they're not necessarily reflected in the price or the copay that the patient sees at the pharmacy. And then they pass along a portion of the manufacturer's rebates to the health plan. So there's this flow through of money and management when it comes to the medications. Then you have the health plans themselves, and we know what the health plans do. You sign up for a health plan and they give you some type of prescription drug benefit, and you pay a premium to this health plan in exchange for that health plan negotiating pricing for the medication. So that's how this whole system works. And at the end, you have the pharmacies. Now, the pharmacies contract with the PBMs for inclusion into their network, and so they submit the claim for reimbursement at these, quote unquote negotiated rates. So if you just alone look at that glossary of all the different players, you see it's not that easy to go from just the drug manufacturer to the pharmacy. So let's talk about some other things that go into the initial drug company. How do they set pricing? We have to be clear and understand that pharmaceutical companies are a business. They're a for-profit organization, so they operate under the same rules and guidelines that all other for-profit companies operate under. So it's all about increasing your value of return to your shareholders. Now, pharmaceutical companies are relatively unregulated, and when it comes to pharmaceutical pricing, they can raise pricing beyond inflation. They can do these things without much oversight. And we've certainly seen that in neurology when it comes to things like the multiple sclerosis medication. It has a lot to do with the supply and demand relationships. And drug pricing is not much different from any other industry. With the nowadays with the GP1s or the glutides for weight loss and diabetes, you see this up and down of the cost of these medications based on supply and demand. As more and more people want to be on these medications, that increases the demand. So you have to rev up supply. If there's a low supply and high demand, you increase the cost. So all of these are basic economic principles that apply to all other industries, but also apply to the pharmaceutical industry. So other things that go into the pricing of medication, the uniqueness of the medication. I remember a couple of years ago being in neuromuscular diseases when the medications came out for spinal muscular atrophy. Now, spinal muscular atrophy is a neuromuscular disease that has devastating impacts. In certain types of SMA, kids didn't live past 2 or 3 months. And in the more milder form, your lifespan was still shortened, but you usually lost the ability to walk. It causes a lot of weakness. So they came up with medications now, it's only 2 or 3 on the market, that could treat SMA. And now kids could live. They could reach certain milestones like sitting up and rolling over and crawling and even walking that they wouldn't have before. Even though there's not a lot of patients with SMA, the impact of these medications is huge. So what's the price for that? What price as a parent would you pay for your child that normally may not have been able to crawl or may not have lived past the first year of life, who now is able to live and able to reach those milestones that they weren't able to reach before? How do you put a price on that? Competition plays a play in drug costs. If a market is heavily saturated, it'll be a lower price. You see this in a generic drug market. And after medication has been on the market for a while, like for instance the medications to treat high cholesterol and so forth, if you have more competition, then the price lowers. But if it's a very rare market, like in spinal muscular atrophy, the price can be a lot higher because you don't have a lot of selections. You may be talking about 2 or 3 drugs to treat this condition. Then those 2 or 3 drugs usually on average are going to be priced a lot higher and more comparatively because one drug can't price itself at $100,000 a year, and the other one comes in and says, okay, we're just going to undercut them and price our drug at $10,000 a year and gobble up the market. There are certain rules that regulate that. So how effective the drug is. Can the drug overall reduce healthcare costs? So there's a condition that I take care of called myasthenia gravis. Now, myasthenia gravis leads to progressive weakness of the muscles. And in severe cases of myasthenia gravis, you can go into crisis where you end up in the intensive care unit on a ventilator because it weakens your muscles of breathing. So if I'm pricing a drug for myasthenia gravis and I can prove that it reduces crisis where you're in the ICU on a ventilator, there's a certain price indication that I can place on that drug that says, hey, you pay less on the forefront for the medication than going into the hospital and getting on the ICU where you're spending tens of thousands of dollars per day in the intensive care unit. Well, if I have a medication that reduces that or zeros the amount of hospital admissions and ICU admissions, shouldn't I be able to price that medication accordingly because of the benefit that it's giving to the patients? So all of these factors play into how a medication is priced. And for the most part, the FDA does not look at pricing when they approve medication. Now, the research and development piece is a pretty interesting one because in the United States, there's an argument that we're disproportionately paying for research and development throughout the world. Don't get me wrong, it takes a lot of financial resources and a lot of money to put into the research, and most of the time you're paying for failures because for every one medication that does make it all the way through all of the research, there may be 10 that didn't. So there's a reason why R&D costs are so high because you're paying in general for the research and development for all of the pipeline drugs within that company. So I remember when I was in business school at Rice, one of the cases that we discussed that had to do with health ethics was a case of Mylan Pharmaceuticals, and it was about balancing profitability and public approval. And it had to do with a couple of years ago when the CEO of Mylan Pharmaceutical decided to raise the cost of the EpiPen. Now, the EpiPen, you need EpiPens at schools, you need EpiPens at fire stations. These are the pens that kids use or adults use when you have an allergic reaction. EpiPens save lives. And just to summarize, when the CEO at the time was asked why was the price of the EpiPen raised, well, it was because that's what the market would bear at the time. And there was a lot of debate as to why the cost of this medication was raised so quickly. But in essence, that's the business part of it. If the market will bear it and if there's a need, then arbitrarily you can do it. But what impact does that have on patients? Why should we care about the cost of medications to patients? And are people even having these conversations? And I can tell you that I am having these conversations more and more, and we need to ask patients because, again, there's a big difference between prescribing a medication and will that patient actually take the medication. Sometimes patients have to make trade-offs for their medications. Maybe their copay every month is so high they're having to cut back on food or other life necessities just to pay for their prescription drugs. I have had people who, maybe you give them something for blood pressure and you wonder why the blood pressure isn't well controlled. Well, come to find out that if this is a twice-a-day medication or a 3-time-a-day medication, they're only taking it once because they're rationing the medication out to try to make a 1-month prescription turn into a 3-month prescription, or a 3-month prescription turn into a 6-month prescription. Or sometimes people look for alternatives that may be dangerous. Perfect example is in certain pain. We saw this in the pain industry where street drugs were tried to substitute for prescription pain medications, and so Patients are going out and trying to find either nutraceuticals or different alternatives so they don't have to pay these high costs of medications. But some of these trade-offs can have catastrophic effects. If you are supposed to be on a medication for blood pressure, but you're not taking it as prescribed, and now all of a sudden you have spikes in your blood pressure that lead to a stroke or heart attack, that increases your overall healthcare costs, all because you're trying to cut back or rationing your medication. So there's a term I'll introduce you to, and we'll get into it a lot more and more detail, but financial toxicity. And we're seeing this more in the oncology field. Cancer is number 2 to heart disease, is some of the most expensive diseases to treat. But of course, if you have cancer, you want the best, most up-to-date treatment. But at what financial cost does that play to you and your family? So drug costs are a considerable component to this financial toxicity that patients are sometimes find themselves in, where you're having to spend so much to treat these chronic diseases. In neurology, there are a list of things like strokes, central nervous system diseases like myasthenia gravis, back pain. All of these things are very expensive to treat and can lead to high levels of medical debt that patients have. There's one study that found that 17.8% of individuals said that they had some type of medical debt. So how do we look at healthcare costs as a way to limit or cut back on this medical debt? There was a study that looked at or a poll rather, that was published in 2022 that found 62% of Americans take prescription medications. 43% of Americans are concerned about affording their medications. And 29% of Americans did not take medications as prescribed. And that includes like cutting back on prescription drugs or trying to ration these medications out. So in general, we need to start having more discussions about the economic impact of care and the economic impact of medications as we discuss this with patients. I like to talk with patients, discuss with patients alternative options, and try to make sure that patients know more about what's going on. And these conversations have to happen early when you're picking your plan. For instance, if you do have a chronic disease like diabetes or high blood pressure, some other chronic disease, if you're changing companies or you're at that point where you're picking your health plan, it's important to talk to that company about things like their tiering system and what drugs are on formulary to make sure that your medication doesn't have to change just because you change jobs. We have to advocate more. Healthcare costs is going to need legislative changes, both at the state level and the national level. This includes things like the ability to negotiate drug pricing. So all of these things lead to the policy changes that we need are going to be pretty big, and a lot of them have to do with FDA guidance. We need Medicare, Medicaid transparency, importing drugs from other countries, maybe cheaper options as well. So as we move forward over the next couple of months and years and addressing this topic of drug costs, it's going to be important to watch for legislative changes coming out of DC. But on a smaller level, on a more intimate level, it's important to have these conversations with your physician, your insurance company. Find out about things like the tiering system and what medications are covered within that insurance plan. And if we can collectively do this on the micro level and on the macro level, I'm confident that we'll be able to address this issue and make sure that patients get the treatments that their doctors are prescribing, and in turn having something to do with reducing the cost of healthcare overall. I thank you all for joining me today, and tune in for future episodes of Your Health, Your Wealth. If you'd like to learn more about what I do, you can visit my website, eddiepattonmd.com, and please consider sharing and subscribing to the show. Thank you.